I'll just give you the summary, and then Elizabeth will work you through some of the details. We have a $47 million total budget, which we think will position us to deal with the difficulties that we're facing. We have a real budget squeeze. So what we had to do was cut spending about $500,000, and that reduced full-time equivalent positions by 5. We're down to 268 people. We also had to increase revenue by $1 million, but we're holding the line on property taxes. The city's property tax rate this year is $1.34 per $100 of assessed valuation, and that's a decrease from last year. We actually lowered the dollar amount of the levy. We're one of the few governments that did that. And you might wonder how or why we would do that when we have a budget crunch. It's because when the hospitals stopped paying their property taxes, that affected the city budget, but we're a very small part of the property tax bill. We used to be about 15% of it. We're now down to about 13%, because the impact of the hospitals is not so much on the city budget, it's on the entire city. It's on all the taxpayers, the residents, and all the businesses. And it creates what I have warned is a downward spiral for the city if we don't get that fixed. So what we're dealing with here is just how you finance the city, how we're going to finance the city government. But what we did was shift away from the property tax because we knew everybody's bill was going to go up, and we picked other taxes that would be shared by people who visit the city as well as the people who live here and the people who own businesses here. One of the new things that we're going to spend on is a new financial management system. We're going to spend $300,000 on that, and if you, we had a very good auditing firm tell us what the weaknesses in our current system are. And accounting systems don't last forever, and we've had a good system that's kind of hand put together, but now it requires multiple entries by hand, and it's just very inefficient, and we don't have the kind of information that we'd like. And for Public Works, we're putting a new work order system in that's going to cost $100,000. And in the main operating account, which is our general fund, we have $32 million in revenues and $32 million in appropriations. It's a little bit higher on appropriations, but generally we spend about 96%. So essentially it's balanced. We asked departments to reduce spending by 2%, and not everybody did 2%. Some did a little bit more, some did a little bit less, but that's what the rough number was to come up with $500,000 in cuts. And the new revenues, we are increasing the city gasoline tax from 4 cents to 5 cents a gallon to get $180,000. We're increasing the food and beverage tax from 0.5% to 1%. That'll raise $370,000, and that's on prepared food and beverages for immediate consumption. Many other central Illinois cities have a 2% tax, so we're still lower than many other cities. We're also increasing the hotel motel tax from 6 to 7%, and this would add $1 to the cost of a $100 hotel room and would mostly be paid by visitors to Urbana. We're also increasing the natural gas use tax from 3.5 cents per therm to 5 cents per therm, but that does not affect most people. That is just for very large industrial, very large utility customers who don't pay the regular utility tax. And finally, we have about $250,000 in fee increases, and half of that is going to the general fund. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Hannan, and then we'll answer questions.
Okay, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of some charts and graphs. Oh, I guess we got them on the screen back there. Skip through some of those ones about the document, and we will email all of you a PDF of the budget document following this meeting. But looking at total revenues for all funds, as you can see in the proposed budget, our total is $44.8 million. And most of that is in the general fund, but some in other funds. And you'll notice that that's fluctuated a lot between FY14, FY15, and the proposed budget. And that fluctuation is largely due to capital improvement projects. So we received bond proceeds for 2 different projects during that time period, for the Boneyard Creek improvements and for Windsor Road. And we also received other state and federal funds related to capital improvement projects. Looking at all funds expenditures by classification, you can see the purple bar on the bottom is our personnel expenses, which is a very significant portion of our budget. But as you can see, the total again fluctuates significantly. And I've pointed out that top portion is our capital expenditures. And as you can see, that's really what's driving that fluctuation from $11.5 million in FY14 to $24 million in FY15 and down to $7 million in the proposed budget. And that again includes Windsor Road and the Boneyard Creek projects, both of which were at least partly debt financed. Looking specifically at the general fund, these are our revenues by source, and I've broken out the largest ones separately. My pie kind of got squished there. But as you can see, our largest revenue in the general operating fund is sales tax. Almost a third of all of our general fund revenues. That's pretty significant. And that's closely followed by property tax, most of which passes through the general fund and is paid out to pension funds, and then income tax. One thing worth noting here is that if you look at sales and income tax, both of which are fairly variable and responsive to changes in the economy, those 2 revenue sources alone make up about 45% of our general fund revenue. That's a significant portion. And then looking at general operating fund expenditures by classification, the total is $32.7 million. And you can see here how much personnel costs drive our budget. Personnel costs are almost 3/4 of the general fund budget, which makes it very difficult to make adjustments to the budget, because anytime we talk about making budget reductions, we're really talking about probably a majority of that being personnel costs. I want to give you a little more information. The mayor talked about having a balanced budget, and this is a balanced budget. I'm going to give you a little in-depth look at that. One of the things as a finance person that we look at is not the total amount of revenue and expense, but how much of that is recurring revenue and expense. So how much revenue can we expect to receive on an ongoing basis year after year, and how much expense do we have to sustain with that revenue on an ongoing basis year after year. So this chart shows the general fund revenue and expense adjusted to recurring levels, so removing big one-time things like grant payments or other expenditures that will only happen once. And as you can see, going across the page, we have the current budget and then our estimate for the current year, our forecast, which was developed for planning purposes a few months ago, and the proposed budget. And as you can see, we started the year with a budget that was really not balanced. We were spending down fund balance. With some adjustments in the current year, we're coming closer, but then our final proposed budget for this year is clearly balanced. Our recurring revenues, our recurring expenditures are about 97% of our recurring revenues, and that's where we want to be to make sure that our budget is sustainable for the long term. So that's a quick look at the financial piece of this. Looking ahead, we have a few things that we really need to be cognizant of. As you all know, the state budget is not complete at this point. We're not sure when that will happen, but there is still the potential that that's going to have an impact on our revenues. We need to, over the long term, maintain a budget that balances recurring revenue and expense. We have some other issues out there that we also need to address in the coming years. Our funding for capital improvements is probably not sufficient to maintain our infrastructure in an adequate condition, so we'll be looking to address that in the future. And we have some long-term issues with funding vehicle and equipment replacement to give our staff the tools that they need to do their jobs. So in terms of our plan for reviewing the budget, tonight we'll do a very similar presentation for the city council to give them the big picture. And then we will take a closer look at the executive department, the public works department, and the fire department. On June 8th, we'll take a closer look at finance, police, library, and community development. And then on June 15th, we will have a public hearing and we will ask council to approve the final budget. And that will wrap up the budget process for this year. So that's it. I think we're ready to take questions.
No, we did not know what was going to happen, so we just assumed that it's going to stay the same, and we'll have to make changes if they'd give us a cut. But there's just, right now, I just see this big battle between the Democratic leaders in the legislature and the governor. So I don't know how that's going to end up.
Yeah, one thing in planning for the budget, I think all of our department heads are aware that potentially we're talking about more cuts. And so I think they've all been giving consideration to what those might be if that's necessary. Also, there are some one-time expenditures in the general fund budget that we could pull back if necessary to make a little more time to give careful consideration to adjustments. So, I mean, we will be able to do that in an orderly way, but it would definitely mean more cuts.
Is there any word on which five positions you eliminated?
Yeah, it was done department by department. I had a vacancy in the human relations, and so we turned it into a half-time job and got a very good person, but that's usually the way it went. It was mostly vacant positions. There's some that had to be adjusted from full-time to part-time, but it was primarily vacant positions.
What's the difference between the forecast and the proposed budget? Why, or I guess why is there a difference?
So the forecast we did very early on in the budget process to help us set the direction and the strategy. And so the difference primarily is that we did a little bit better than expected. We did a little bit better job of making reductions, and the revenue increase will be a little bit more than we anticipated.
We have appropriations, which are authorizations to spend, but actual spending is a little bit different from that. It usually comes in lower, usually runs around 96%. So you have to look at both. And revenue, we try to project conservatively. We're not going to have a real high estimate. We're going to have what we think is reasonable and achievable. So we hope that that comes in a little bit higher. But the spending will generally be less than what's appropriated.
I think in the past when we raised the gas tax, you didn't really see it. I don't recall what it is, neighbor in Champaign, but it hasn't, we didn't see a real impact.
Well, when I started out with that proposal, we just needed to fix potholes, and the state gasoline tax, the federal gasoline tax have been held constant for decades. So in real terms, they've gone down because the cost of repairing roads and constructing roads has gone up. So we started out with a 2-cent gasoline tax that was gradually going to increase. And Mike Munson surveyed other communities, and we found, much to my surprise, I thought it was going to go on to the price, that the communities that had a gasoline tax and the neighboring communities that didn't, the prices were the same. And Danville had a 5-cent tax, and Peoria has a tax, and a bunch of different communities. And so it seemed like something reasonable to do. And I think this is a real classic thing that I know congressmen are very reluctant to deal with raising the gasoline tax, but when we raised it in Urbana, people were happy that the potholes were going to be fixed. I think if you see the results of the tax and it's something that you want, you're not going to complain about it. And we did not get complaints about it. And then the city of Champaign passed a 4-cent tax. And we realized that we were just going to lose money because the prices were going to be the same in Urbana, so we also followed with the 4-cent tax. And if you look at Savoy, which doesn't have a gasoline tax, and they'd have to do it by referendum because they don't have home rule, the prices are the same as in Champaign and Urbana. So it's something that I think the public understands and can see the results, and we put up a sign for an improvement project that says this project paid for by your local motor fuel tax. Well, we've spelled out everything that we're going to do, and the council will be voting on it tonight, but they approved it at the committee level last week. So it's all spelled out. And if the state comes up with some kind of a reduction, they always come up with more work for us to do, but they don't usually come up with the revenue. So if they want to cut the revenue, then we're going to have to revisit this. But our approach has always been a combination of spending cuts and revenue increases. We haven't just done one or the other. We do both. And that actually is what the leadership in the legislature also proposes. So we don't know what they're going to come up with, but we will be lobbying to make sure that cities can perform our basic function, which essentially is public safety. Yeah, that's a new source of revenue. That, I mean, we didn't know when we started. Some communities said they're not going to have any, and some of them have changed their mind. It's really taken off in the state, much far beyond what Lou Lang, who was the person who pushed it in the legislature, he was surprised at what a huge interest there was in this. So we don't have as many as Champaign on a per capita basis, and both Champaign and Urbana have far less than the city of Springfield does. I think Springfield sort of, carried it as far as it can go. They're pretty much saturated, but yes, that is a significant source of new revenue for us. We have maybe, we took but there's a new variation on it, which is mostly the gambling parlor. It started out with restaurants and bars, but then there's places that are strictly dedicated to gambling, and they usually have women's names. I guess that's what they think their market is. There's ladies that want to go gamble, but they don't want to go to a bar, so they go to one of these little places. So, new business.
Yeah, and in the revenue detail, you'll be able to see that we're estimating for this year our share of the state video gaming revenue is $160,000, and for next year we've increased that to about $315,000. It's a complicated question. And a lot of this has to do with not how much they're spending on overtime, but how we're accounting for it. So, there's been some turnover in the finance department the last few years. And police department often does overtime activities where they receive reimbursements for that. And for many years, those reimbursements were offsetting the overtime expense in the expense code, which from an accounting and financial reporting perspective really isn't accurate. So those revenues, when they began accurately recording expenditures as expenditures and revenues as revenues, it appeared that there was a large increase in their overtime expense, which really wasn't accurate. So we're going to clean that up in this year's budget. So while it appears much larger, that doesn't really tell the whole story. Public Works also, I want to say that their budget for snow and ice removal has been probably underfunded for many years. So typically you want to budget for sort of an average winter, and we will begin doing that. Our estimate for this year is higher. than their budget, and for next year, then we'll continue with a higher budget that reflects more accurately what we expect it to be.
Any other questions?
The tax increases is something
Which one? I think they're pretty modest increases, and they're all within what other cities in this state have. So it's a question of how do you finance the services that people in this city rely on? And we have very good services. We have an excellent police department. If you saw the chart about the bank robberies and how they get solved pretty quickly, I think the police department's doing a good job on things like that. But those are very essential services that we don't want to cut. And if we have to lower the property tax, which we wanted to do, then we have to find the revenue from other sources. And we think the sources that we've chosen are more fair and more acceptable to the average taxpayer. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming.